please come on in. We're here to hear the author of, by the way, my name is Rahul Pandita. I'm in art history department. I was asked to introduce Mr. Rahul Pandita, who is the author of Hello Bastard, The Untold Story of India's Maoist Movement in 2011, and with Nilesh Misra, The Absolute State, Insurgency as an Excuse for Misgovernance in 2010. And now his most recent book is Our Moon Has Blood Clots, The Exodus of Kashmiri Pandits, 2013, which has been widely reviewed and commented on in the blogosphere. Its emotional narratives have touched the heartstrings, especially of members of the Pandit community. Rahul Pandita is a journalist, now associate editor with the Open magazine in Delhi, where he writes articles nearly monthly about Jammu and Kashmir. And they combine reporting with kind of advocacy journalism, almost editorial kinds of writing that aspires to speak truth to power, and framed as political editorials sharply criticizing the present and past leaders of Kashmir and the Congress government handling of Kashmir. Probably I don't need to do much by way of introduction, but just so that it's on the table, Kashmir was a princely state until 1947 with a majority Muslim population and a Hindu Dogra ruler. Its accession to India, rather than Pakistan, was up in the air until the last minute, and then only under the threat and fact of force from Pakistan. Issues of promises of mandates were never redeemed, and the Valley has a long history of Indian government manipulation of elections, imprisonment of popular leaders, and governors from the center appointed by New Delhi, and this central government continues down to today. Until in the late 1980s and early 90s, the Troubles began. And these troubles included the often violent intimidation of the non-Muslim Kashmiris and their subsequent exodus, about which we will hear today. Kashmir was then occupied by the Indian Army, intent on rooting out militants, and armed and encouraged by Pakistani radicals, Kashmiri Muslims continued to bleed and be squeezed in highly militarized zones. Armed patrols continue on a regular basis in the villages, and the street protests continue in the cities. So this is very much of an unfinished story, one chapter of which we will hear about today. Among the many possible historical narratives about the complex region of Kashmir, today we'll hear one that is, I believe, very personal and personalized. And so please join me in welcoming Rahul Pandita.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honor and privilege to be speaking here in front of you. And I thank my friends at the Northwestern University for giving me this opportunity. Now, I'm not here to speak to you as an expert or as a specialist, because that is not what I am. I speak to you as a traveler who has learned the most valuable lessons of his life while traveling through various theaters of war. I've traveled for weeks with the Maoist guerrillas in Central and East India, where people are so resigned to fate that they think hunger is a disease. I met men and women who went to some of India's best schools and are today running a radical group, a radical insurgent group that India's Prime Minister has recently called the country's biggest internal security threat. I've been at the site of a bomb blast that killed so many, and I was so close to it that I could taste explosive powder on my lips. I've been a journalist for about 17 years, and not a single day passes when you're out there in the field on an assignment and you don't learn a new lesson. I'll just briefly mention a small story which I experienced in Iraq, on the border of Iraq and Jordan in March 2003, where I had gone as a young reporter to cover the US invasion on Iraq. Now, about 2,500 of us, journalists from all across the world, were stuck in Jordan because we didn't have a visa and the borders were sealed. And we were looking for an opportunity to cross over to Iraq to report from there. Now, we would try our best to report as much as possible from Jordan. There was a constant influx of refugees from Iraq. Jordan has a formidable population of Palestinian refugees who would protest against the United States every now and then, and we would cover it. So in due course of time, I made friends with this young Palestinian driver in Amman, in the capital, who went by the name of Muhammad. Now Muhammad and I had a deal. He would take me wherever I wanted, and in the evening he would take his money. But once a day, he would treat me to a cup of Turkish coffee, which he said was his treat every day. And we had a lot of time to pass because there was not much to report. And every now and then, I would hear him sing this really silly sing-song ditty, which in Arabic went something like this: Bush, bush, shili dak, hadal hachi, my fidak. Now I found it very funny, and one day I asked him, I said, what does this mean? And he would speak in broken English. And he said, this means, roughly translated, Mr. Bush, don't put your hands into Iraq, you'll burn your hands. Now, we were looking for an opportunity to cross over to Iraq, and one day we got an opportunity when there's this friend of mine who was a Romanian journalist. She bribed a couple of Jordanian border officials, and they said, okay, we'll let you pass through the Jordan border, but what happens to you in Iraq is none of our responsibility. So you'll have to sign an undertaking to the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan that the government is not responsible for our safety, but we'll let you pass. And we said, fair enough, we just need to go to the Iraq and we'll figure out what needs to be done. So on one particular day, we are made to sign this undertaking, and we cross the border from Jordan, which is called Ruwaishit, a place called Ruwaishit. And soon enough, after walking for about 300 meters in the no man's land, we come across the Iraqi border, which is called Al-Karama, and there's a giant statue of Mr. Saddam Hussein right there standing in front of us. And as soon as we reach the border outpost, we're surrounded by the Republican Guards, a group of them, about 20-25 people, wearing their loose gowns, a belt neatly struck around their waists, and heavily armed. In due course of time in Jordan, we picked up a few Arabic words just to help us communicate with the local population. And I said, Sahafi. Sahafi in Arabic Urdu means journalist. I said, we are journalists. And there's a passport, and I showed them the passport, and so did others, the two of us, the other two journalists who were with me. And there was no visa there. And suddenly, all of a sudden, before we could explain anything further to them, the chief of this group, he became very hostile, and he started shouting expletives at us in Arabic, which we couldn't understand, but his tone was getting very hostile. And all of a sudden, they started cocking their AK-47 rifles, and I was thinking to myself, oh God, we are dead. And I look at my colleague, this Romanian journalist. The whole blood is drained from her face, and her ears are pulsating like that of a rabbit's. And suddenly, due to some, when I look at it in hindsight, I think it was some kind of divine intervention. Suddenly I start singing this silly sing-song ditty which I had learned from my friend Muhammad. Bush, bush, shili dak, hadal hachi my fidak. And they must have found it very funny. The first instant response was that the AK-47 rifles, the barrels came down, and the chief caught hold of his stomach, of his belly, and started rolling on the road with laughter. So in the next few minutes, these people called villagers from around and made me sing this sing-song ditty about 50 times. At the end of which I was so frustrated and tired that I thought to myself, if he asked me to sing it again, I'll say just put a bullet through my head. So they did not let us cross into Iraq, but they put us into a vehicle which is coming from Iraq back into Jordan. And then 3 days later after that episode, we crossed into Iraq, which is another story for another day. But when I came back from Iraq, I realized that I was so stressed that I had forgotten the PIN number of my bank ATM card. Now it may not be a big deal for many of you, but it is really a big deal for someone like me, who has a John Nash kind of fascination with numbers. I even remember the water connection number given to us by the state government in Jammu and Kashmir at a home, at a place which was my home 23 years ago. It was 44732. Our friends in Delhi who work with various big newspapers, even business newspapers, and they report mostly from Delhi and other big cities, and they often ask me why I put myself through such hard situations. Why does a life of a poor tribal in some God-forsaken place appeal to me so much? And now these are highly successful journalists who know the meaning of stuff like inclusive growth, trillion-dollar economy, etc. Now it's very difficult for me to explain to them that my empathy for the poor and other such marginalized people comes from my own homelessness, my own uprootedness. That home whose water connection I remember is the only home I have, and that home, ladies and gentlemen, was in Kashmir Valley. That home is still there, but it does not belong to me. We were forced out of this home 23 years ago on the morning of April 4, 1990. My parents have never returned to Kashmir ever since. I go there often on assignments, but I avoid traveling in the general direction of my home. My home is occupied by someone else. I'm in exile for the last 23 years. My whole community is in exile. Today I'm going to share my story with you, and I'll tell you why it is the duty of all of us sitting here to ensure that this exile breaks and that I return to my homeland. My friend was kind enough to give you a background of the Kashmir issue. Kashmir has been a bone of contention between India and Pakistan ever since India attained independence and became India and Pakistan in August 1947. Now Kashmir was ruled by a Maharaja, a Hindu ruler, who had a choice either to go to India and Pakistan, and he decided to be independent for some time. But that independence was not for long when Pakistan sent its Pakistani army regulars along with the marauding tribesmen from the northwest frontier province to attack Kashmir. And in that last moment, like my friend said, the Hindu rulers signed the instrument of accession with India, and Kashmir became a part of India. Kashmir is the only place, Jammu and Kashmir, the state of Jammu and Kashmir is the only place in India where Muslims are in majority. And the Hindus, locally they are called the Kashmiri Pandits. I am a Kashmiri Pandit. We are a small religious minority in Kashmir. We are everywhere now after the exile, from Jammu and Kashmir to Johannesburg, and no matter where we are, we work hard. We may not have enough to eat, but we make sure that our children go to school. We may live under a tin shed, but we make sure that we have books. These are tough times for us, but we do have the audacity of perseverance. My ancestors have lived in Kashmir for thousands of years, and they've spent their lives in pursuit of knowledge. It is they who took Buddhism to central Tibet, painting some really magnificent murals all the way till Tibet. It was one of them, whose father was a Kashmiri Pandit, who translated the Lotus Sutra, the Buddhist Lotus Sutra, into Chinese. The Guru Padmasambhava, or Rinpoche, who is also referred to as the second Buddha, spent a lot of time in Kashmir, drinking from its knowledge reservoir. Now history is taken to be as a weak spot in Indian literature, generally. but it was my 12th century ancestor, a scholar called Kalhana, who wrote the magnum opus Raj Tarangani, which is considered among the world's most extraordinary historical works. India's first Prime Minister happened to be a Kashmiri Pandit as well. We're everywhere in the United States as well. We are space scientists, professors, engineers, entrepreneurs. In particular, I'd like to mention the name of Mr. Neil Kashkari, who's worked with both the Republicans and the Democrats to help America tide over some serious economic challenges. But before I begin telling you about one particular night in January 1990, when the Exodus really began, I'll tell you why this story is relevant today. In 1999, an Indian Airlines flight, IC-814, was hijacked by terrorists from India and forced to land in Kandahar, Afghanistan, that was then under the control of the Taliban. The government of India chose to negotiate with these hijackers and agreed to release 3 terrorists in exchange of the hostages. Now, one of them was Masood Azhar, who was the founder of the radical Islamist group Jaish-e-Mohammed, who had been arrested from Kashmir in 1994. The second one was a Kashmiri terrorist called Mushtaq Zargar, who had killed scores of innocent people in Kashmir, including Kashmiri Pandits. The third was a man who loved to play chess and indulged in arm wrestling. He had kidnapped a few tourists, foreign tourists, in Delhi and kept them hostage in a Delhi suburb. The local police stumbled upon them when they had gone there to investigate a case of cycle theft. He was freed as well. These 3 people were freed as well. Less than 2 years later, investigation by the US officials revealed that the same man, the third man I mentioned, who was fond of playing chess and indulging in arm wrestling, his name was Omar Sheikh. He's the same man who wired $100,000 US to a man called Muhammad Atta. Now, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room who Muhammad Atta really was. He's the man who rammed the aircraft on 9/11 at the World Trade Center. This is the same man who, a year later after this, planned the abduction and beheading of a young journalist with an infectious smile. His name was Daniel Pearl. Now, why I'm telling you this story? I'm telling you this story because these are the men who are responsible for my homelessness today. They are the same people who rammed an aircraft in the US Trade Center, World Trade Center. They are the same people who appear on YouTube declaring a jihad against the United States of America. They are the same people who send their mercenaries to a Jewish center in Mumbai and lie to listen over the phone the sound of people being shot. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, I must take you to the Kashmir of the 80s where I was born. That is the Kashmir where there was a coffee house where people would gather, poets, writers, artists, intellectuals. There was a man who was nicknamed Sartre there, and he would sit with his other friends and discuss existentialism. That is the Kashmir of the 80s, of the 70s, where foreign tourists would come and stay in floating boats that we call houseboats, some of them named after their foreign patrons, Alicia, Catherine, or Rosaline. It was a favorite destination of George Harrison, the lead guitarist of the Beatles. I recently stumbled upon a photo shoot of the Vogue magazine, the fashion magazine Vogue, done in the 16th in Kashmir. We had movie halls where one could watch films like The Guns of Navarone or a James Bond flick like The Spy Who Loved Me. Today, that coffee house no longer exists. It was closed after a bomb blast in 1989. There are no movie halls either, and those who were nicknamed Sartre are in exile. It all began in the autumn of 1989 when we heard murmurs for the first time that a few men had crossed over to Pakistan for arms training. Now we dismissed it. We had been at the receiving end of religious intolerance for centuries, but it never came to such a bad pass. We had learned to live with that. We would live like submarines. Whenever there was any unpleasant riot, communal riot, or any such other act, we would just lower our head and hope for things to pass. Because after all, it is not easy to leave the land where your forefathers have lived for centuries. It is very difficult. But by January 1990, our worst fears had come true. There were guns in the Kashmir Valley now, and they were there to target us. In September 1989, one of our community leaders stepped out of his house and he was gunned down. A High Court judge was waylaid on the road and shot dead. We were getting signals after signals in 1989. My mother, she was a government servant and she was traveling in a bus one day when an old man happened to help an old Pandit lady to get down from the bus. The others in the bus from the majority community lashed at him for helping her out. They said he should have kicked her out. Some of us in the 88 and 89 would be renovating our houses, and we would get to hear this from our neighbors or colleagues. Oh, why are you wasting your money on renovating your house? Tomorrow or maybe day after, this house is going to belong to us. And ultimately they did take it away. They did take it away in January 1990, and we realized it fully on the 9th of January 1990. Now, I believe in the United States, people ask each other, where were you when Kennedy was shot? I think the Pandit equivalent of that would be, where were you on the night of 19th January 1990? In January 1990, ladies and gentlemen, there were about 75,000 families in Kashmir, Pandit families in Kashmir, constituting about 350,000 people, or maybe 400,000 people. That is less than 5% of Kashmir Valley's population. It is in January 1990 only that a Harvard graduate made a very passionate speech in Islamabad in Pakistan. Her name was Benazir Bhutto. She said that the Kashmiris had the blood of the Mujahideen flowing through their veins. She invoked the Ghazis. Ghazis in Arabic means the destroyer of infidels. And she invoked them to fight a jihad in Kashmir. But she had no idea that the same Ghazis, the same Mujahideen would devour her 17 years later. It was around this time that on state television we watched in horror visuals from Baku in Azerbaijan of the Christian Armenian population being beaten up, tortured, raped and then expelled. But in Kashmir we were still hopeful. We thought this too shall pass, and that is what we said to each other. But it did not pass on the night of 19 January 1990, and that is why I say that the night of 19 January 1990 was the longest night of my life. Now, very aware and respectful of a sense of proportion, and it is really unequal to compare our exodus with the Jewish Holocaust. But let me take a minute or two to describe to you how the night of January 19, 1990 was our Kristallnacht. My family lived in a Srinagar suburb. It was a small neighborhood comprising of about 20 Pandit households. Around us there were localities, and in a radius of less than 1 mile there were 4 mosques. In January, Kashmir gets a very harsh winter spell, and there would hardly be anyone on the roads after late evening. My family, like all others, retired for the day after dinner. And I was very young, I was 14 years old, and in my sleep, all of a sudden, I was startled from my sleep. And I thought I was hearing some noises coming from the road. Then I realized all of a sudden that there were hundreds of thousands of people outside my street. They were in the mosque and other public places. And there was suddenly a whistling sound of a loudspeaker from the mosque, from my neighborhood mosque. And hundreds of thousands of people started shouting slogans from these loudspeakers. And these slogans were directed against the infidels. Some of them were anti-Indian also, some of them anti-Pandit also. And one slogan in particular scared us a lot that particular night. The slogan was, and I quote it in Kashmiri, "Asikas Panui Pakistan, Bata Rosti Patn Insan," which means we want our Pakistan without Pandit men, but with their women. My mother was so scared, and I had an elder sister, that she took out a knife and kept it by her side. And she said to my father that if the mob comes to attack us, I'll just kill my daughter, kill our daughter, and I'll kill myself, and then you men do what you need to do. This night passed somehow, and the next day we realized that this was not something which has happened in our neighborhood alone. This had happened in every street, every village, every district across Kashmir Valley. In other places, stones had been pelted at Pandit houses. At some places, mobs had come out carrying petrol cans, threatening to burn down houses. And we must realize the time. This is 1990, when there was no social media network, there was no Facebook, there were hardly any mobile phones, there were hardly any landline phones around. The basic telephone density in Kashmir Valley in 1990 was very low. So this was very pre-planned to scare us into exile. And the formula was very clear. Kill one person, and kill one person in such a brutal fashion that it scares thousands into exile. Now, many times, when I talk about this to friends like you, I'm often asked, how did that night feel? And for years, I did not have an answer until I read this brilliant graphic novel by an artist called Art Spiegelman. He's done a novel called Mouse, where he interviews his father, who is a Holocaust survivor, who was a Holocaust survivor. And he asks him how it felt to be living under the Nazi regime. And his father startles him by producing a loud boo. And he says, it felt like that, but always. The exodus began from next day onwards, from 20th January 1990. There was absolutely no administration in sight. Nobody came to our rescue. No government, no Indian government, no security forces. There was no one in Kashmir Valley on the night of 19th January 1990. Right afterwards, on the roads, processions of hundreds of thousands of people would stream out. The slogan mongering also kept on happening. At several places, old Pandit men and women were forced to lead processions. At some places, candy and coins were thrown at us. That's a local culture which is done when a dead person is being taken for his last rites. When someone is taken for his last rites, you throw candy and coins at him. So this candy and coins were thrown at living people, Kashmiri Pandits, to tell them, to signal to them that they were already dead. In the next few months, hundreds of innocent Kashmiri Pandits were killed. Some of them, like I said, in extremely brutal fashion. Professors, doctors, nurses, engineers, writers, shopkeepers, unemployed, housewives, even pregnant women were not spared. I'll give you a couple of examples to highlight to you the brutality. In downtown Srinagar, in the old part of Srinagar, there was this young telecommunication engineer called B.K. Ganju. He was 37 years old. One fine morning, 3 terrorists came to his house. They were looking for him. Now his wife begged to him and said, "You must hide because these people are here to kill you." So he raced to his 3rd floor, to his attic, and he hid himself in an empty rice drum. Now the 3 terrorists searched for him all over. They could not find him. So they left. While they were leaving, now this is the old part of Srinagar, of Kashmir Valley, where houses are very close to each other. Now when this person was hiding in this rice drum, one of his neighbors, his Muslim neighbors, saw him hiding in that rice drum. And when the 3 men left, she signaled to him then that the person was hiding in the drum. So they came back, shot him dead, and forced his wife to eat the blood-soaked rice. A young laboratory assistant in North Kashmir, in the rural Kashmir, a place called Bandipura, a young woman called Girja Tikku, she was abducted by her own neighbors and colleagues, blindfolded, gang raped in a car, and then cut alive on an electric saw. Because of these brutalities, because of what we saw on the roads and because of what we heard about these killings, by October 1990, in these few months, barring a handful of families of Kashmiri Pandits, all of us had been forced into exile. And it was so sudden that it uprooted us completely. We left in whatever means of transport we could get. There were no United Nations trucks for us. We had no idea where to go. We just kept on moving through the treacherous mountain passes. Our first goal was to escape from the Kashmir Valley. And we didn't realize, but we had become refugees in our own country. Most of us landed first in the Jammu city, which is about 300 kilometers, roughly 220 miles from Srinagar. That summer was the most difficult time of our lives. This is the first summer we had to spend in the dusty Indian plains, in torn tents and one-room dwellings that were couch heads earlier and had been put on rent by enterprising landlords after painting them with cheap whitish timber. Now imagine a 70-year-old woman who has spent her whole life in New England and is forced to live in Texas in a tent that does not even have a table fan. I remember there was this old man my family used to know. He used to live in one of these refugee camps. One day he was found dead with a pack of chilled milk pressed against his right cheek to provide him support from the heat. The refugee camp was set on the outskirts of the city on a land which was infested with snakes and scorpions. In the first year itself, dozens of people, elderly people especially, died of sunstroke and snake bites. We suffered from so many ailments which were unknown to us earlier. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, insomnia, stress-induced heart diseases, hypertension, anemia. Later we also realized that the children had contracted high levels of lead poisoning because of the unhygienic water supply. In the tents, in these torn tents, there was no privacy. That led to a drop in fertility rates. Youngsters would have to delay marriages and prefer not having children. Even after 23 years of what happened in Kashmir in 1990, we still have a high mortality rate and a very low birth rate that has plunged us into a negative growth rate. Nobody came to our rescue. The government of India did not care about us since we did not form a formidable vote bank. The human rights groups in India did not take cognizance of our plight since they have a perverted idea of liberal discourse, plural discourse. The left liberals ignored us because it was not fashionable to talk about us. The international policy groups and NGOs and media only focused on state-specific human rights violations. For them, it was a black and white situation where the majority community in Kashmir was being brutalized by the Indian state. But what they didn't realize or chose to ignore was that the same set of people had brutalized another set of people who happened to be Kashmiri Pandits in this case. The international political delegations came all these years, but instead of understanding the dangers of radical Islam, it facilitated the role of militant groups. Some of the murderers were profiled as if they were liberators. Even a quarter of a century later, the international community has failed to realize that the ongoing movement in Kashmir is a theo-fascist movement, masquerading as a liberation movement. The idea of home, ladies and gentlemen, is central to our existence. It is not something which the Kashmiris only have. I believe in America also, owning a house is a much cherished dream. But especially in case of the Kashmiris, it is a bond which is very special for us. Back in the 80s, there was in Kashmir, we had no concept of bonds or money market funds. Whatever any middle class family had was all put in the home. Generations of Kashmiri Pandits struggled to rebuild lives so that the future generations won't have to suffer. I was earlier talking to you about 1947, when the tribesmen came from Pakistan and attacked certain parts of Kashmir Valley. At that point of time, my mother was a toddler and she lived in a border area in North Kashmir called Baramulla. The house my grandfather had built very lovingly with all his life savings was reduced to ashes in 1947. There were 7 major massacres of Kashmiri Pandits at the time in 1947. Now, along with my father, my mother rebuilt this home, rebuilt their lives in the 70s in Kashmir. And this house where I was born was built with my father's retirement savings and my mother's bridal jewelry. But that too is gone now. But that is not all. What has happened in Kashmir in our absence in the last almost quarter of a century is extremely tragic. More than 600 of our temples have been vandalized or destroyed. Some of them date even before the Bamiyan Buddhas. Initially our houses were burned down, but then they realized that once we burn down the houses, the people also get insurance claims. So they started vandalizing it and looting away everything, including electrical and sanitary fittings. Many houses in Kashmir Valley, which belong to Kashmiri Pandits, have been forcibly occupied. At several places, schools of the radical Jamaat-e-Islami have been opened in our erstwhile homes. In the last few years, we have witnessed a large-scale effacement, cultural effacement in Kashmir. Ancient names of places have been changed to erase any signs of our existence there. Revenue records of temple land and other shrines have been changed. Even the government has grabbed our land in many cases for widening roads or building fire stations. I also mentioned to you in the middle of my talk about a handful of Kashmiri Pandits who have chosen to stay back, especially Pandit families who lived in rural areas and did not have any reference to context of a life anywhere else. They could not even imagine living anywhere else because they were too ignorant about certain things. Their whole life revolved around the 20-mile radius of their homes. They stayed back. And what happened to them? In 1997, 7 Pandit men were lined up outside their homes and shot at by terrorists. On the night of January 25, 1998, an entire Pandit cluster in a village in central Kashmir was wiped out. 23 people died that night, including 11 women and 2 children. On the night of 23rd March 2003, armed men struck again in another village in South Kashmir and killed 24 Pandits, including 2 children, after making them sit in a common courtyard and shooting all of them in faces. On June 16, 1997, a young professor was dragged out of a bus along with his 2 under-Pandit colleagues and shot dead. His name was Ravi. His name was Ravinder and we used to call him Ravi. He was just 34 and had an 18-month-old son. He was my brother. I was in Delhi when I received the news of his death. The same night, I took a bus to be with my family. And on the outskirts of the city where my family lived, I saw my brother's photograph splashed on the front page of a newspaper. In all these killings of hundreds of Kashmiri Pandits, there has not been a single conviction so far. There is a terrorist who goes by the name of Farooq Ahmed, who has confessed on television in front of a journalist that he has killed at least 20 Kashmiri Pandits with his own hands. But he is free today because nobody in India is interested in pursuing his case. He was in jail for a few years, and while releasing him on bail, the judge remarked, and I am quoting him, "The court is aware of the fact that the allegations levelled against the accused are of serious nature and carry a punishment of death sentence or life imprisonment, but the fact is that the state prosecution has shown total disinterest in arguing the case." I won't be surprised if Farooq Ahmed lands in the United States one day, like many other terrorists and terrorist sympathizers have in the past from Kashmir Valley. We had a lot of faith in the Indian state, in the world's largest democracy. We had a lot of faith in the media, in the Indian intelligentsia that claims to be rallying behind the right of the minorities. But they have only helped our murderers deny that a religious ethnic cleansing took place in Kashmir in 1990. There's a book written by this Holocaust survivor called Simon Wiesenthal. It's called The Murderers Among Us, and in the book, he quotes the SS militiamen admonishing the prisoners in a concentration camp, and he quotes them, "However this war may end, we have won the war against you. None of you will be left to bear the witness, but even if someone were to survive, the world would not believe him." And that is exactly what has happened to us in Kashmir, ladies and gentlemen. Many conspiracy theories have been floated in the last 2 decades about the circumstances that led to our exodus. And that reminds me of a story I read in the New York Times a few years back about this survivor from Auschwitz who returns to her street in Austria, and she meets one of her neighbors after 3 years who smiles at her and says, "Oh, I haven't seen you in a long time. Where have you been?" That is precisely what has happened. The bigger betrayal for the Kashmiri Pandit community, bigger than what happened in 1990, is this extreme denial of the circumstances that led to our exodus. Every now and then, we hear someone from the Indian government making some statement about our return. Yeah, they will return. Yes, we are making arrangements for them to return. But they treat us as if we're victims of an earthquake or a flood. But they forget to recognize that we are victims of a political disaster. We are victims of an ethnic cleansing. And that is why all my friends sitting here today must understand the true nature of the so-called liberation movement in Kashmir. It's not only about Kashmiri Pandits. It is also about these unsung Malalas in Kashmir Valley who belong to the majority community in Kashmir, who have been killed brutally by the jihadi groups. One only has to read the local newspapers in Kashmir to understand how this radicalization is destroying everything in Kashmir and creating dangers for the international community. The choice today, ladies and gentlemen, is not to save the Kashmiri Pandits only. The choice is to save the international order, because as all of us know, jihadi groups are not restricted to a local area today. So it cannot be a terrorist in Boston and an unidentified gunman in Kashmir Valley. The United States and the West in particular must realize that Kashmir is the eastern front of the war on terror. Thank you.
I assume you'll take some questions?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Thank you. This is very moving talk. What would be the solution? What is your solution to at the current state of the crisis? What would be the solution? What is the goal you were looking for?
Well,
what outcome would you?
I wish I had all the solutions, but a couple of things. One is to destroy this jihadi machinery which comes from Pakistan. I think a friend of mine puts it fairly well. The only terrorist organization in South Asia today is Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, ISI. That would be one goal, because like I said, terrorism is not restricted geographically now. People who are planning something in Kashmir might plan something in, God forbid, America tomorrow. So that is one thing. The other thing is to ensure that enough security is given to Kashmiri Pandits for their return. From the international community, we request them to put enough pressure on the government of India for the return and rehabilitation of Kashmiri Pandits. In the recent past, the United States, in the post-9/11 scenario, they've cracked upon a number of networks here in the United States, meant for sending money and other support to the jihadi groups in Kashmir that are operating from both Kashmir and Pakistan. But that is not enough. More needs to be done. The government of India has not done enough to follow on what the United States has done. For example, the United States has cracked down on this particular gentleman called Ghulam Nabi Fai, who was running a network here in the United States. He's in jail right now. He has given a lot of intelligence inputs to the US security agencies, which have been shared with the Indian security agencies. But while the US has cracked down on his network here, nothing similar has been done by the Indian government. So they have this very ambivalent approach when it comes to Kashmir. Kashmir, for them, is still a piece of a real estate. So even if Pakistan tries for 5,000 years, Kashmir is never going to go out. But that means nothing for us Kashmiri Pandits who have lived there for thousands of years. So the government of India and the international community must take steps together to ensure our return. Yes, please.
Do you think the events that you described would have played out differently had media taken notice of it then or soon after? And do you think, like a media campaign like the Jessica Lal in Delhi, do you think it would still have gathered public support in favor of the people?
Absolutely. I think the media has failed completely as far as the story of Kashmiri Pandits is concerned. Elsewhere in India, there have been times when similar, not of this magnitude, but the other riots have happened where minorities have been threatened and killed and displaced from their homes. There, the media has played a very active role. In Gujarat riots, for example, which happened against the Muslims in February 2002. Even after 10 years, there's been enough coverage and legitimately coverage of the events in 2002 in the state of Gujarat, but nothing about us. That's why, because I said, as I mentioned, the media, for them, it is largely a very black and white issue, where they're only concentrating on the human rights excesses done by the Indian state, which they must. I'm not saying that they should not. But there's another side of the story, which is our story, which they do not find fashionable at all, because it does not have the usual stories of the Mujahideen and the guns, etc. It does not bring to them this romantic notion of a group of people fighting a particular state. That is why the whole community in such distress today. Yes, please.
Did you feel that between the years of 1999 and 2004, when the government changed and BJP was in power, that there was any shift in government policy, or has it been uniform throughout 1990 and now, regardless of who has been in power in Delhi?
I think it's absolutely uniform. No matter who has stayed in power in New Delhi, maybe Congress or the BJP, for us Kashmiri Pandits, there has been no change at all as far as the Kashmir policy is concerned. Yes, please.
I'm a little concerned, or I hear you suggesting that America should put pressure and that the Indian government has failed in so many ways. But what about the local Kashmiri perspective? I mean, it has changed, and the present day experience in the Kashmir Valley is very different after these 20 years or more, and they have the impact of the terrorist minority is dwindling. Wouldn't you agree? And there have been attempts locally to reach out or to acknowledge what happened as a
you mean vis-a-vis Kashmir?
Within Kashmir. Yeah.
Right. Things have changed a bit because in the last 23 years, the local population has grown tired of terrorism, because there are times when even they are at the receiving end of terrorism. So they have realized that there's a small minority among the majority community in Kashmir, who are educated and their families are settled elsewhere as well, who know the truth of the so-called freedom movement in Kashmir. And they know that their welfare, long-term welfare, lies with India rather than Pakistan, especially with what is happening in Pakistan in the last few years, where even the minority among the Muslims are being targeted day after day. But that is a very small minority, and they cannot speak openly because then they fear get killed. But what is worrying for me, because I am a journalist and I visit there quite often, almost 3-4 times a year, is that there is this large population which is becoming radicalized with each passing day. You see these young kids on the roads wearing Arabic style abayas and hijabs, and there are these clerics who say that we must follow Sharia. I had a couple of clippings, I wish I could show it to you, but that's all right, I can tell you about it. So these two things are going simultaneously. There's this whole generation of youngsters who were born after 1990, and they were born amidst curfews and crackdowns, and their response to death is frightening. Sometimes I interact with them. The way they have been radicalized in the last 20 years, it frightens me really. But as far as the issue of Kashmiri Pandits is concerned, both the elite which I mentioned earlier, or the so-called educated, or this radical group, the response is the same. Extreme denial. There has been not a single acknowledgement in the last 23 years from anyone, from the former militants who have become leaders now, or from the local population, from intelligence in Kashmir, from the media in Kashmir, from anyone in Kashmir, that look, we must move forward, we must reconcile, we must have truth and reconciliation. But you know, this is what happened to Kashmiri Pandits in 1990. And this did not only happen because there were a handful of people who came from Pakistan with arms. It also happened because neighbors signaled to the terrorists that here was a man who was hiding in that rice drum. Here was a woman who was gang raped in a moving car. That was not done by terrorists. That was done by your own neighbors. That was done by your own friends. That was done by your own colleagues in offices. That is something which they haven't acknowledged so far. And that is why I say that that is a bigger betrayal than the events of 1990. Yes?
In a lot of activism, the youth play a very large role in bringing events to light. Do you see the youth playing a similar role in the situation that you detailed?
I wish they could. In Kashmir, we have journalists, and you have writers who are speaking about certain events. Some of them are true. Like I mentioned, there are some state excesses in Kashmir, which should be recorded, and as journalists, it is your duty to record. But as far as this reconciliation is concerned, or any acknowledgement, or any true reporting of the events of 1990 and post-1990, there's a complete blank slate. I'll just give a small example. I mentioned to you this one massacre which happened in this sleepy hamlet in central Kashmir, in a village called Vandhama, where 23 people, 11 women and 2 children were lined up and shot dead. When I was researching this book, I came across many reports filed by local Kashmiri journalists about the events of, after the next morning of the massacre, where these dead bodies are lined on the floor. And some reports say that how the neighbors were concerned and they were wailing over the dead bodies. Now this massacre has a lone survivor, a young boy who was 14 years at that point of time, and he hid himself behind a heap of grass, dry grass, and he was saved. He was so numb with pain that he hid himself behind that heap the whole night, and in the middle of the night he came out because he was young and he thought that his family members and members of extended family might be saved if he saved them from the cold. So he took out quilts from his house and put them on the bodies and hid back. It was only when the police came in the morning that he came out and narrated his story. He is a grown-up man now, and I wanted to meet him. He has been very reluctant to meet anyone. He has not met anyone all these years, leave alone a journalist. I think in the 17 years of my career as a journalist, I've gone, I've seen a lot, but I don't think I've been as persistent with any other story or with any other interview as I have been with him. So finally, in the course of my interview, in the course of my research, I finally managed to meet him. And he told me a story which shocked me completely. He said that as the militants, as the terrorists were shooting his family, it was a night of the Shab-e-Qadr, which is a holy festival for the Muslims. It is the night rather, when the Holy Quran was recited to Prophet Muhammad. He said that when the terrorists were shooting his family, the villagers, the local villagers in the mosque, increased the volume of the loudspeaker in the mosque to muffle the gunshots so that it could not alert the police or the army. So that is the kind of role even the local media, these young men and women have played as far as our story is concerned. Yes, please.
So I studied truth commissions in Latin America, and I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you've looked at any of those parallels. So, I mean, there were a lot, almost every country in Latin America has had a truth commission. Violence that happened in the 70s and the 80s.
In South Africa, for example.
And it's in South Africa and I think South Korea. There's been some,
Yeah.
I mean, really, I think 45 countries that have them.
Yeah.
And they kind of, it's like a very similar situation where the government denies, but there are these groups that are it starts small and they start recording, they start interviewing people and collecting data, and then eventually they can form, when it becomes safe enough to, can form a group, and then that kind of grows, and then there's some kind of political shift that happens that all of a sudden they form this truth commission at a nationwide level, and then it's just like floodgates.
Yeah.
And then it becomes a very popular thing, and sometimes that takes
Absolutely.
20 years, 30 years before you can do that.
Yeah.
Is there any effort, have people studied how other countries have done that? Is there any effort to start collecting testimonies in one place?
I'm not sure whether the other models are being studied, but in the last few years there have been some references to Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I've heard a couple of times statements from leaders quoting the South African example, and that's why I've been quoting that back to you. But nothing has happened so far on the ground. It's been 23 years, but the problem is that even after 23 years, as a journalist who reports very extensively from Kashmir, I think that we must move on as two communities, Muslims and Hindus, in Kashmir Valley. We must move forward, but that moving forward will not be possible until there's a consensus on the circumstances that led to Exodus. Currently, I don't see that happening even in the next 5-10 years. I don't see that happening because of the extreme denial mode which the majority community in Kashmir is.
I guess my question is related to how well organized is the community? Do you have leaders who are articulating your cause and trying to lobby with the government? And if you are trying that, what is the vision that you have for the community?
I don't have all of these answers, but you see, what happened is that in the last many years, especially people from my generation, we lost everything. We even lost our scholarship in many ways because a major portion of our lives was spent in regaining some of what we had lost in Kashmir. But that phase is gone now. Most of us are doing well now for ourselves because we are almost a 100% literate community, and over centuries we have laid a lot of emphasis on education because this is not for the first time this has happened to us, and this feeling is sort of in our DNA that we must educate ourselves, and that is the only way out in situations like these. But in the process, what has happened is that we're not concentrated in at one place. We're everywhere. We have a community in the United States of America in almost every state. You know, they're working for their livelihoods. They're contributing to the local society. They're active everywhere. But as a cohesive force, I'm afraid we've not been able to do much. We have community leaders, mostly based in the Jammu city, and they try their best to create awareness about what has happened. Sometimes the government of India, just as a symbolic measure, when it is negotiating with the militant leaders or the separatist leadership in Kashmir, or with the mainstream political leadership in Kashmir, or when there are these symbolic seminars, track to diplomacy between India and Pakistan, sometimes they call our leaders also, and you know, our leaders talk about certain issues, especially about our rehabilitation and return. For example, I must tell you that right now, even after 23 years, there are many families, thousands of them, who are still languishing in refugee camps in Jammu and other parts of India, and they're getting a monthly dole which is less than even the Indian Planning Commission's absurd definition of below poverty line. So that is the situation on ground as far as Kashmiri Pandits are concerned. Yes.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say thank you for speaking here. It was really good to hear your perspective. I just wanted to add that would you agree that in addition to the militancy groups which did have an anti-Pandit sentiment, that there was a general atmosphere of terror during 1990? Because I say this because I personally am Kashmiri. I'm from a village called Shopian, which I'm sure that you know, and my grandfather, he was from a Muslim family, and he founded the J&K Communist Party. He was also assassinated by Pakistani militants, and I've heard a lot that, like, just in Kashmir, that a lot of people actually have started to acknowledge this suffering, and I also think it's wrong. And just one point I wanted to say was that sometimes I get the implication that you're saying that the majority Muslim community was very hostile to Pandits, where I've heard a lot of stories that some people did really try to help, and like even when my grandfather was assassinated, he was very popular, but no one came to protect us because everyone was so afraid of the implications. And so I just wanted to hear.
I get your point. No, when I said there were cases when the local Muslim population, ordinary Muslims, took part in the brutalization. Of course, I'm not trying to implicate the entire community, which is very large. You see, what has happened is that if we compare 1947 and 1990, when the tribesman attack happened, when these marauding tribesmen from Pakistan entered, especially from North Kashmir, there have been many instances of friendship between Kashmiri Muslims and Pandits. There's this legendary young man called Maqbool Sherwani, who was a Kashmiri Muslim, who had to pay with his life to save Kashmiri Pandits and to save the Kashmiri territory from falling into Pakistani hands. So in 1947, you have had many examples of such deep bonds between the Muslims and the Kashmiri Hindus, the Pandits. So much so that when Mahatma Gandhi came to Kashmir in the summer of 1947, and that is the time when India was ravaged by the violence of the partition, and he said that Kashmir offers the only hope in the subcontinent right now. But I'm afraid by 1990, so my father's generation, they had a really good time. I mean, there have been unpleasant cases, incidents of communal riots. For example, in Anantnag, not very far from where your grandfather lived, in 1986 where scores of Kashmiri Pandits were, their houses were vandalized, their women raped, etc. So this has been happening since 1947 onwards. But these cases were far and few, so we sort of lived there. But in 1990, I'm afraid there were hardly any such cases where the Muslim community came forward to save the Kashmiri Pandits from the horror that was being played out on the roads. So in 1990, a significant majority of Kashmiri Muslims played a role in the brutalization of Kashmiri Pandits. Now you're right when you're saying that many from the Muslim intelligentsia, like your grandfather who was a communist leader, what's his name by the way?
Abdul Sattar.
Of course, I know him. I visited his grave also. So there were people from the Muslim intelligentsia or poets or some writers even who were targeted initially because of their political leanings. But the Pandits were not targeted only because of their political leanings. They were targeted because they were Hindus, and that is where the difference is. There has been this propaganda over the last 23 years that only those Kashmiri Pandits who were in the police or in the intelligence agencies or communists were targeted. But like I said, I have 786 cases, documented cases, where unemployed housewives, shopkeepers, children were attacked who had no political ideology. They were not communists. They were not writers who wrote against the movement, the so-called movement in Kashmir. So we were only targeted because of our religion.
Can I say something here? I'm a Kashmiri Pandit. We are all from the same family, from the Gupta. You're right when you said, we cannot paint the whole community as against us. Give you an example. I studied in Kashmir from 1980 to 1975 to 1985. Okay? I was living outside Kashmir. My father was in a government service, central government service. He was always outside the country, outside Kashmir. In 1975, we decided I need to settle my family because he was transferred every time. So he said, what best place to go but home? So we went back home. We built our home. In 1990, in February that he was talking about, January, my dad and my mother were in Kashmir, in their house. I was in Delhi, and I kept on telling him, get out, this is not safe. He says, don't worry, I have a friend here, and I don't have to worry about it. It was his dream house. One day he was walking out from there, because we didn't have a bus to that place. He was walking down, went to the butcher shop, and then there was a hair cutting salon, and these are the places where you get all these people meeting. He has his hair cut. He's got a brown mustache, tall, handsome guy. He looks like as if he's from the intelligence service. He had nothing to do with the intelligence service. He was working in the Geological Survey of India. And all his years he was working in places like Rajasthan, hot areas. And this was his time for retirement. He wanted to stay. A person comes to him when he's having his hair cut and says, Darsab, you seem to be from the Indian intelligence service. And this is a guy who he meets every day. And he says, no, I have nothing to do with intelligence. And he tells him that you need to be careful. There are people looking for you. Has nothing to do with that. And next day he says, I think we will go. But what does he do? He left everything that he had. He said, no, I know this place. I'm going to come back. Because he didn't want to go anywhere else. He spent all the summers of his life in the plains of India. He picks up a suitcase, leaves with my mother, saying, I'm going to come back. I had a tape recorder, those spoons that had all my grandparents, everybody's recordings there. That was the only connections I had. All my pictures, my family pictures, my pictures from my childhood, they were there. He said, I'm going to come back. Never went back. My mother died in 1992. She never went back. My father finally went there 2 years back and said, you know what, enough of it, I can't stay. And sort of. However, we come from Vichara, which is a very religious place. He's still not, in the last 3 years, he has gone to Kashmir. He stayed with the Muslim family, stayed in his house. So we're not saying that everybody is there. He stayed in their houses.
You see, what is happening now is, because I go there often and I know people who go there often. Like I have friends from Kashmir Valley and they are my schoolmates. We have studied in school together. Some of them are journalists now in Kashmir Valley. So when I go there, we meet, we eat, we embrace each other, we joke about certain things because this concept of language is so important. We have a connection with them, a connection which we do not have with the rest of India because of language. Language is such an important thing. The kind of sentiments or emotions a language invokes, it's magical at times. When I go to Kashmir at times, when I speak in Kashmiri, sometimes words stumble out of my mouth, words which I did not even knew existed, that kind of thing. But now, when I meet my friends, we never talk about the events of 1990 because that is one bone of contention between us. But if you go to Kashmir, there's one thing which happens, and it's not something which the majority community in Kashmir does deliberately. It is something which is embedded in their subconscious now. The first thing, when you land at the Srinagar airport, and there's a taxi driver you know for the last 20 years who comes to pick you up, or a friend or a neighbor, the first thing, or maybe the second thing he'll ask you, till when are you going to be here? So as long as you are going there as a tourist, spending money on cabs, spending money on hotels, getting dry fruits and Kashmiri carpets back from there, and after 3 weeks bid a tearful farewell at the Srinagar airport, everything is fine. And they'll, friends in private will acknowledge, what happened in 1990 was terrible and, we miss you, etc., etc. But the moment you say, I'm looking for a piece of land here and, I'm thinking of coming back or, finding a job for myself, the whole body language changes. That's the story of our lives. Some of you are young, you are university students, etc. And I don't know what you will do. You will make a career out of your lives, and you will be working at hopefully important places. And as far as Kashmir is concerned, there will be one narrative which will come to you many times because that narrative is very well documented, and it should be, fair enough. We have nothing against that narrative. But I'm hoping that what you heard today, some portion of it you will keep in mind when you're dealing with the narrative, if you have to deal with that at all.
That sounds like a fine closing words. You have it, so join me in